There are places where the sun combines forces with the moon to create a celestial tugging of the waters, the tide. In certain tidal zones, where rivers and streams meet the sea, fresh waters mix with the salt. Only a few creatures, like the great blue heron, feed from both. These places are called estuaries, from the Latin word estus, meaning tide. This is the story of South Slough, part of the Coos Estuary in Oregon. The tide of one of the richest places on earth. The tide of the eagle and the eelgrass. The tide of the heron. Before daybreak, creatures of the night finish their nocturnal haunts. They live in the uplands, the beginning of the estuary's watershed. Here, the uplands are forested mountains and valleys that transport rain into freshwater springs and streams. It's morning in South Slough, and many of its creatures, like the great blue heron, leave their upland homes to hunt elsewhere by day. The great blue is an ancient and majestic bird, its species more than 60 million years old. The heron has aged gracefully while keeping its distinctly prehistoric look. The uplands offer shelter and protection for many types of wildlife that feed near and in the estuary. From red-tailed hawks and great bald eagles to the black bear who's left his claw marks on this alder. Bobcats live in the uplands, as well as deer, elk, and cougar. To look at them, you may never guess what they eat. For instance, the 800-pound elk is an animal that eats plants. While the 1-inch sundew is a plant that eats animals. Well, insects and spiders. And the wispy lichens get their nourishment from the air. The freshwater supply for this part of the estuary watershed actually begins right here with Hidden Creek. This narrow stream has been carrying pure water to the estuary for thousands of years, and its constant flow has carved a small but deep canyon. On the lower slopes, the forest gets dense and thick with berries and ferns. Then suddenly it's flat. The look of the land changes, and the uplands give way to the marshes. Water from the uplands flows to the flats, creating spectacular marshes, every bit as lush as a tropical rainforest. The first is the Freshwater Marsh, and skunk cabbage is its star. With its distinctive odor and preposterously huge leaves, up to 4 feet long, the skunk cabbage is impossible to miss. Here, the waters begin to mix. It's not easy to tell exactly where the freshwater marsh ends and the saltwater marsh begins, because the saltwater comes in with the tides. The salinity of the estuary changes season by season, hour by hour. The Estuarine marsh is home to plants that can adapt to those changes in salinity, like certain rushes, grasses, and sedges. In the saltier end of the marsh flourish salt-loving plants, and the salty-tasting pickleweed, all fed by a constant ebb and flow of water that appears and disappears around them. The combination of tide-borne nutrients and the sun generates a wealth of lush plant life that makes these marshes one of the richest places on Earth. But to some, the richness lies in the answer to that eternal question: what's to eat? And the answer: everything. From a bevy of insects to nutrient-rich detritus, the marshes create a feast for a catalog of colorful birds and wildlife. Like the red-winged blackbird, the white egret, the greater yellowlegs, and the great blue heron, who patiently waits for its prey and then makes one swift stab with its long dagger-like bill. Many people believe that life on this planet began in an estuary. Nature's lush garden in the estuary marshes makes it seem so. Beyond the marshes are the tide flats, where the tides cause the estuary waters to rise and then fall, retreating to the ocean. Water moving at 1 billion gallons a second make the tides in this estuary dramatic. Twice each day, 60 million tons of seawater flushes in and out of the Coos estuary, submerging, then revealing the expanse of tide flats. At first glance, the tide flats might look barren compared to the marshes, just a blob of mud. But the sediments teem with life: gastropods, arthropods, nudibranchs, and more. A young Dungeness crab the size of a fingernail searches the water to feed on microscopic zooplankton. This whole community of crabs lives under one blade of eelgrass. Here, tunneling through the mud with great determination, is the delicate ghost shrimp. Above the mud, a pair of raccoons hunt for any food they can get their paws on. When the tide comes in, the otters go fishing. Tide flats are the favorite fishing grounds of the heron, who patrols a chosen spot and guards it jealously. And certain two-legged mammals are frequently seen digging for food in the tide flats as well. In the estuary tide flats, every cubic inch of mud hides a host of wonders. Finally, the estuary connects to the sea. Its open channel harbors even more ingredients in the stew of estuary life. Eelgrass sways with the tide, each blade loaded with microscopic diatoms, eggs, and detritus, available for grazing. During migrations, the estuary is host to large flocks of waterfowl, here to rest, refuel, and even find a little romance. For about a week, the golden eyes put on their courtship display. Dozens of species of fish and commercial seafood live in the estuary's open waters at some time in their lives. From the well-disguised flounder to crab, prawns, perch, and salmon. Farther down the channel, closer to the sea, life becomes even more colorful. Tube worms snatch their dinner in spectacular fashion. Sea lions follow schools of fish and fishing boats seeking a meal. while the smaller, less aggressive seals find small fish in the estuary. Coming down from the uplands, through the marshes and over the tide flats, the open waters of South Slough wash through the Coos estuary into the ocean. And soaring over it all is the great blue heron, 2 powerful wing beats a second, 20 miles an hour, ever searching for food through time and tide. South Slough is part of the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, one of more than 20 protected sites around the nation. At South Slough, more than 4,000 acres are managed for research and education to help improve our understanding of estuaries and their value. More than half of our nation's wetlands, including its estuaries, have been lost to development in the last 50 years. Scores of marshes, tide flats, and meandering channels have been replaced with buildings, piers, and marinas. But more and more, people are coming to recognize both the beauty and the wealth in these rich waters. Estes, the tide, the tugging of the sun and moon in that place where fresh water meets the sea, the estuary. It's the tide of otters and arthropods, the tide of eagles and eelgrass, the tide of the heron, flying home at night to its nest, protected high in the upland trees at South Slough.